Credem că lumea a devenit un loc mai periculos și mai imprevizibil, dar nu este așa. Lumea a fost mereu plină de pericole, însă a evoluat și ceea ce s-a schimbat, de fapt, este natura amenințărilor pe care le avem de înfruntat. Acum nu mai sunt dinozauri sau hoarde de invadatori conduse de lideri nemiloși. Avem, în schimb, încălzire globală, terorism, atacuri cibernetice sau state dispuse să fie agresive pentru că nu mai vor să mai respecte regulile internaționale. Avantajul este că tehnologia ne permite să facem previziuni mai clare despre riscurile la care suntem expuși. Discutăm cu James Carafano, vicepreședintele Heritage Foundation, despre ce înseamnă siguranță națională, Homeland Security, cum spun americanii, în secolul în care trăim. Sunt Cristina Cileacu. Începe Pașaport diplomatic. James Carafano, Vice President of Heritage Foundation, welcome to Diplomatic Passport.
It's so good to be with you.
Sunt mereu riscuri și amenințări pe care un stat trebuie să le anticipeze și să le evalueze. O țară nu este vulnerabilă doar pentru că este atacată de o armată inamică, de teroriști sau de agresori cibernetici. Protejarea securității cetățenilor include aspecte variate, de la schimbările de climă cu efecte greu de controlat, până la migrație sau discurs al urii. Și exemplele nu se opresc aici. Cum se structurează prioritățile pentru ca o țară să fie sigură și să poată să se apere eficient, indiferent de natura amenințării pe care o înfruntă? Pe lângă managementul riscului și măsurile de prevenție, un element cheie este capacitatea de adaptare rapidă atunci când situația o impune.
Let's start our discussion with the idea of homeland security, because if we look in this century, we see that all the challenges are somehow shifted. We have much more natural disasters, we have much more migration, we have a lot of cyber attacks, we also have an ongoing pandemic. How hard is to actually shift the interest of homeland security towards these new challenges?
Yeah. Well, the concept of homeland security is really post 9/11. I mean, I think post the end of the Cold War, we all thought threats were gone. We certainly didn't think of foreign threats coming to our shores. 9/11 reinvented that. Particularly challenging inside the United States, where we've never had a concept of kind of integrated domestic security. We've always prided ourselves in having federated law enforcement, individual states, very limited federal authorities to do domestic intelligence and other operations. So wrapping your head around the idea of protecting the homeland, that was an interesting post 9/11 challenge. That has almost evaporated, not because the notion of threats to the homeland have disappeared, because in some ways they're actually more significant than other, but it's the practicality of the distinction between the problems inside the border and the problems beyond the border are increasingly evaporating. They're so integrated that the real challenge is not just integrated from a security perspective, but governance, climate, environment, public health. They're all essentially challenges that transcend your border, and you have to address them that way. And this, I think, is the problem with modern governance, is it's not really designed for this, because what you really need is this integrated capacity. And I think the pandemic demonstrated that, because there were economic dimensions. We have supply chain issues in the United States now. It's not just a public health issue. And so bringing all these elements together in an integrated way is really difficult. And I think what authoritarian regimes have demonstrated is the answer isn't the consolidation of power, because, yeah, they can integrate all these things, but that doesn't actually make them very good at using them. I think the Chinese are actually a very good example. There wouldn't have been a global pandemic if the Chinese had not so consolidated control of power that they lost control of the outbreak to begin with. So the challenge for free governments is to how to integrate capabilities to deal with problems, but at the same time not have all the baggage that comes with consolidated centralized power and all the advantages of sustaining individual freedom, innovation, creativity, but having the flexibility to adapt and the ability to really integrate, and doing it in a way that creates good public policy and not just about politics. So for example, I think climate and environment are a very good example. I think we all care about climate and environmental issues and consequences. But I think what's often driven the agenda in the United States, I think in other countries as well, is politics. It's a political agenda that's driving it, not really a common sense agenda based on, well, how are you going to deliver energy? How are you going to deliver innovation? How are you going to take care of your supply chains? What is actually practical in terms of mitigation? I actually think governments are starting to adapt. I think 5G is a good example. You know, in the United States, when the 5G issue erupted, many people just said, nobody can compete with China. Nobody can offer an alternative to this. We're going to have to learn how to live with the Chinese controlling global telecom systems. And then, you know, people said, no, we don't have to do that. And I think in the United States and other countries, in Great Britain, we've actually demonstrated there are alternatives.
Vulnerabilitățile gadgeturilor personale sau ale sistemelor informatice deținute de țări pot fi exploatate de cei rău intenționați. Deopotrivă, și serviciile de securitate pot avea același tip de acces. Tehnologia ne forțează să ne obișnuim cu ideea că dacă o informație a devenit digitală, indiferent că este personală sau de stat, ea ar putea la un moment dat să fie accesată și de cine nu trebuie. Problema mai gravă este cum sunt folosite aceste informații.
Let's go back a bit to the authoritarian regime, since you brought up the issue. We see every day cyber attacks from state actors, from non-state actors, so it's an issue of our century. Also, in the same time, we see that the security services all over the world have, let's say, wider access to all sorts of devices, even personal devices.
Right. Well, you know, one of the challenges I think we've had, and again, it's I think the kind of the hangover of the end of the Cold War, is we convinced ourselves that there were no longer existential threats. And so we really didn't have to grapple with these difficult issues. And now we've seen the rise of authoritarian regimes, particularly with Russia and China. And what I think a lot of us have been doing is saying, well, we have to take these seriously. But we've spent so much time trying to convince people that Russia really is a threat. Russian energy blackmail really is a threat. Russian cyber capabilities are a threat. China is a concern. China's rise is destabilizing. It can undermine democracies. It can destabilize regions. It can, you know, strangle companies and free enterprise. We spend so much time trying to convince people that we don't talk about, but they have weaknesses of their own and problems of their own, and we have to spend as much time talking about how do we exploit those weaknesses, how do we mitigate the threats, as we are scaring people that they're a threat. Cyber is actually a good example. I mean, I think the blunt reality is, and I'm sorry if you've been hacked or...
I haven't, as far as I know.
Yeah, but a lot of people have. But the reality is we have figured out, generally speaking, how to live in a world with cyber activity, just like, you know, humans have figured out how to survive with, you know, periodic hurricanes and everything else. We are moving on to the new problem. Mm-hmm. And that, I think, is what people really have. And it is really the nuclear weapons equivalent of great power competition. And it deals with information dominance. Because the Chinese plan is really to become the global information superpower. That nuclear weapons are a sideline business for them. Their goal is they're going to dominate control of the world's information. And then through that, they're literally going to be able to control everything that's important to them. And we know this because of the focus on two really key technologies. One is artificial intelligence. So artificial intelligence is important not just because it allows you to process a lot of information, but what makes artificial intelligence really powerful is the access to masses of amount of information to process. That's how you really find the interesting and important things that nobody else has. Where I could use the massive information to literally know everything I need to know about you if I wanted to blackmail you or destroy you, or if I wanted to make you the next president of Romania.
No, thank you.
You pair that with quantum computing. So quantum computing is like an iPhone is to an old rotary telephone. Yeah. It's just a level of processing which is transformational. So if you pair the ability to automate, analyze without human beings, and masses of information with this massive computing power, you literally can potentially be an information superpower. That's the new challenge. You know, in the United States, we often talk about Facebook and Google and YouTube and all the information, and they can censor us and everything else, and we have to deal with that. And I say, yeah, you're right, but what you're concerned about them doing to you, China is trying to do it, and they're going to do it without any of the constraints or rule of law or anything else, any controls whatsoever. So we need the solutions to survive in this massive world where people can process and look at our information, and that is the challenge that we need to focus on.
Implică oamenii în lucruri la care se așteaptă, pentru că pe acelea sunt capabili să le discearnă și acelea le confirmă proiecțiile, îi instalează în tipare previzibile de răspuns și le ocupă mintea cât tu aștepți momentul extraordinar, cel pe care nu îl pot anticipa. Este doar una dintre metodele de cucerire eficientă pe care le descrie generalul Sun Tzu în Arta Războiului. Manipularea este o armă redutabilă și lupta împotriva acestui fenomen devine tot mai greu de dus, când frontul de luptă este internetul.
But till China will manage to do that, we still have to challenge what internet offers us today.
Right.
And let's take the example, since we are still in pandemic times, the example of the anti-vaccination campaigns.
Yeah.
Can we say that this type of acts that are on internet with the help of social media and so on are acts of war?
Well, you know, certainly an act of war is defined by the actors, right? There is no clear definition of that. The reality is forget about vaccine misinformation. There have been things that have been done online that, under reasonable standards, really are acts of war. Nobody's declared war over them. So it's the question that doesn't really matter for the answer, because the answer is probably nobody's really going to declare war over that unless it's Pearl Harbor or something in that category. So trying to find this dividing line between war and non-war and online activity, probably not worth it. I think the problem with this is people look at this as an online problem, like our electrons versus their electrons. Your problem is not with vaccine disinformation online. Your problem is with the people that are creating those campaigns. Some of them linked to adversarial governments. So it's not the online activity that's the problem. It's the behavior of the actor that's the problem. And that's where I think we've often missed the farm. So in the US, for example, we had this hack called SolarWinds. So SolarWinds, very dominating cybersecurity company in the United States. People got into their systems and then through their systems compromised all kinds of stuff in the private sector, in the government sector. This SolarWinds could not have happened without the complicity of the Russian government. It's just a fact of life. The U.S. response was what? Well, we have to figure out how so we can make sure this hack never happens again. That does nothing to actually influence Russian behavior or the vein of criminality in Russia that allows these kind of threats to proliferate. If you're not going to deal with Russian behavior, then you're not going to deal with this problem. And so I think we make online problems as these kind of unsolvable things, and we have to control the internet, when the reality is you know what? This is no different than dealing with Genghis Khan or Attila the Hun. If you don't deal with the problem, you're not dealing with the problem.
Regulamentele internaționale devin opționale pentru state care, deși au aderat la ele la un moment dat, preferă să se comporte ca și cum ce este scris în tratate poate fi evitat. Lumea evoluează și, bineînțeles, că anumite reguli trebuie readaptate, dar sunt câteva chestiuni fundamentale, precum suveranitatea statelor sau drepturile omului, care rămân veșnic valabile.
Diplomacy has also facing these challenges, but again we are looking at, let's say, much more aggressive leaders, people who don't want to talk to each other, which is the essence of diplomacy. You have to talk with somebody you cannot agree with. Is it able to face this new world diplomacy?
Well, I think the problem is to talk about diplomacy as if this is this independent tool that operates in and of itself. It's like if you have a toolkit and diplomacy was the hammer, and you take the hammer out and say, okay, I'm going to build a house now. Well, you can't build a house with just a hammer. The hammer and the saw and the screwdriver, they all work together. So I think diplomacy is evaluated in the context of all the elements of national power and how they're put together. And oftentimes if you use the other elements of power effectively it makes your diplomacy more valuable. There's plenty of effective diplomacy in the world. Just look at what the Chinese are doing. The Chinese do massively effective diplomacy. How do they do that? Because they go in and they threaten and they bribe and they cajole and they do backdoor deals. And then they say, okay, and now you have to do this for me. The Russians do this all the time. They say, you know what, I think we'll have to jack up the price of your natural gas 1,000%. On the other hand, if you happen to veto this resolution in the European Union, you know, maybe we can work something out. That's effective diplomacy. And it's effective diplomacy because it's tied to economic power, military power, and other elements. And if we're seeing weaknesses in the diplomatic structure, it's not because diplomacy is not a relevant tool in the 21st century. It's because we're not using the other elements together. So a very good example of this is international organizations. Mm-hmm. People think, well, this is the optimal place to get together and norm and establish norms and work things out. Well, what's actually going on in international organizations today? China is infiltrating these organizations. They're bringing their people in. They're getting them hired at all levels. They're making those people responsible to the Chinese Communist Party. And their goal there is not to work out international norms and diplomatic solutions. Their goal there is to make sure those institutions support Chinese priorities and goals. So it's not a failure of diplomacy. It's a failure of governments to act responsibly.
Before we started this recorded interview, we did talk about the Black Sea, since you are here in Romania, and you told me something, that the Black Sea issue is much more present in Washington. Explain please again to the public how come the Black Sea is important now? Well,
the Black Sea region is important in a number of different ways. It's an energy transit hub. It's critical to the collective security of the transatlantic community, because it literally is the hinge of security on NATO's border. It is a potential avenue of influence from Russia. It's a potential entry from China. So I mean, you're cursed to live in an important part of the world. I mean, and I think people are coming to realize that. You know, even the China issue, people say, well, we have to compete with China. And some people think, well, that means we have to run to the Indo-Pacific to deal with the Chinese. Well, to me, that's like the police rushing to the bank after the bank robbers already left. China's a global power with global interest and influence. You have to be present and compete in all parts of this world. So I don't think anybody in the United States in the last 4 or 5 years has doubted the importance of a prosperous, stable, peaceful, and secure Black Sea region. Ukraine's obviously brought that to the forefront. That recognition isn't going away. So it is, I think, a real relevant and important issue in the United States. I also think it's the byproduct of really great power competition. One of the ironies is people think that great power competition, well, it's everything about what China does and what Russia does and what Iran does and what the U.S. does. And the rest of us should just kind of stay out of it, you know, so we don't get trampled. Well, that's actually not how things work. When great powers compete, small countries, maybe not small in size, but other powers actually become more important for a couple of reasons. And Romania actually fits all of them. One is you're at an inflection point in a geostrategic area of importance, so you're actually more important to the United States in some ways than a larger, more powerful country in Western Europe, like, you know, France. In great power competition, you want friends that you can depend on. Like-minded nations make better allies. For the United States, a country that is free and independent and self-reliant and believes in free market institutions, that's more like who we are, so that you make a better ally. And the other thing is you know, great powers can never be great enough. They always need friends and allies. And the reality is small countries often bring more things to the table than they take away. They bring more value added. So, you know, I won't say that Americans have good answers for Black Sea security, or they are consciously waking up every morning thinking, how can I engage with Romania? but they do recognize that this is an important issue and one that they need to take seriously.
So that this idea that is going around in this area where we live, that Washington has only eyes for China, not for the Black Sea anymore, and Romania in particular, is not true.
Well, I think this particular administration would rather disengage more from Western Europe if it could. Having said that, I think there's a broad bipartisan consensus in the United States that that's not really practical and that's not really going to happen. I think even this administration is finding out that it really can't do that, and it's difficult, which is why, for example, we recently saw the U.S. Secretary of Defense come here. He wouldn't come here if this wasn't an important region. So I think even this administration recognizes that this is an important part of the world. Having said that, I think the challenge is we need to be more proactive. We need to grow the bilateral relationship. We need to deal with the issues of instability in the Black Sea region. We only do that by demonstrating initiative and moving on, not by waiting to see if more bad things happen and trying to deal with them. I think that's the challenge that we have right now, and I think we only address that by being kind of proactive on both sides. I think Romanians need to step up and say, this is what America needs to bring to the table. They need to step up and say, this is what we as a region can bring to the table. And I think that is the only way that we're really going to go forward. It's like the difference between waiting for the fire to break out and then calling out the fire department, or getting out there and really doing fire safety and prevention before things happen. We need to get more into the making sure bad things can happen mode than getting ready to respond if bad things do happen.
I'll keep this optimistic note and
sure.
Thank you for this interview.
Thank you.
Atât pentru astăzi, dar rămânem în continuare online pe pagina de Facebook a emisiunii și pe contul nostru de Twitter. Revenim cu subiecte noi din lumea diplomației și a politicii externe, vinerea viitoare de la 11:30 și reluare sâmbătă de la 22:30. La revedere!